Okay, well, thank you, Julian. Thank you, Patricia. That was a really fascinating way to kick off today's discussion. So I'd like to say firstly, thank you to Henrique and Jasmine for persevering with this workshop, which I really think is more important than ever now, 1 year later, in the context of everything we've been through since. So I'm going to talk today about rights-based philanthropy in Brazil and ask if and how we as academics and activists should understand and engage with philanthropists funding human rights work in Latin America. So I should start with a kind of disclaimer here. This is going to be a rather unusual presentation for me because most of my work is focused on critical analysis and how elite philanthropy in Brazil is actually deeply unhelpful in challenging structures of inequality and social injustice. But in practically everything that I've written recently, I found myself including a footnote. And that footnote notes that in recent years, we have seen in Brazil the emergence of a very small handful of Brazilian philanthropists focused on human rights, but that they are very much the exception to the rule and not the focus of my critique, and then I go on to do the critical stuff. So today I actually want to focus on that footnote and explore the potential that might exist in the work of these exceptional few. Let's try and change my... Okay, so before looking at these exceptions, I'm going to briefly sketch what elite philanthropy in Brazil does generally look like more broadly. These are just some images of the kind of things I'm going to be talking about. I don't actually know this family for reasons of anonymity. I can't put up pictures of people I do my research with, but this is the kind of wealthy family in Brazil that we're talking about. So elite Brazilian philanthropy is usually carried out by corporate foundations, often connected to elite family businesses. It tends to focus on causes such as education, professional training for young people, income generation programs, and culture and the arts. In its attempts to promote development and tackle poverty, Brazilian philanthropy does not usually take a human rights and social justice-based approach. Instead, it takes what I would call a based approach on the premise that solutions to Brazil's development problems are to be found by better incorporating the poor into the existing neoliberal market economy through provision of economic opportunities and the fostering of entrepreneurialism. In recent years, Brazilian philanthropists have also enthusiastically adopted new philanthropic models for impact investing and social finance, which see the financialisation of philanthropy through for-profit business models designed to deliver both social impact and financial return. Importantly, most Brazilian foundations are operating rather than grant-making. This means that unlike most British and North American philanthropy, which takes the form of grant-making to fund the work of civil society organisations, most Brazilian foundations design and run their own programmes, either exclusively or alongside grant-making activities. Now, this is a really important distinction in the discussion of philanthropy and human rights, because the low levels of grant-making seen in Brazil immediately set Brazilian philanthropy apart from the civil society organisations fighting for human rights and social justice across the country. And this distinction, I argue, has really deep historical roots. The origins of organised civil society and social movements in Brazil can be traced to the period during and immediately after the country's military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985. In which the NGO sector emerged as a politicised project based on an ethics of human rights, the pursuit of social justice, and the fight for the return to democracy. During the same period, institutional forms of philanthropy that we see today in Brazil emerged as a corporate movement to redefine the social role of business in Brazil's new era of economic neoliberalism. From the very beginning then, these two movements were characterised by radically different aims and political allegiances, and it should therefore not be surprising that elite philanthropy has never funded Brazilian civil society organisations or CSOs. In the absence of philanthropic funding and with limited state support, Brazilian CSOs have historically relied on international philanthropy and foreign aid. In recent decades, however, this support has dwindled. And in the current political climate, in which has described activity as a form of terrorism, many human rights CSOs and social movements are now facing a serious funding crisis. So in the context that I've just described, philanthropic grant making to CSOs becomes a really radical proposition for elite Brazilian philanthropists. While organised civil society in Brazil has inevitably diversified in focus since the 70s and 80s, much of its activity is still defined by ongoing struggles for recognition of the human, social and economic rights of Brazil's poor and marginalised populations. CSOs work across a range of themes, all highly politicised in the Brazilian context, including racial justice, gender equality, LGBT rights, land rights, and agrarian reform, prison reform, and many others. As such, philanthropic grant making to these CSOs constitutes an explicit commitment to those working to promote social and economic inequality and human rights, a very different project from that pursued by most Brazilian philanthropists. Oops, sorry. Over the past decade, however, key intermediary and philanthropy advisory organisations have begun to promote direct grant making in the Brazilian philanthropy sector, and they've launched a number of initiatives to encourage grant making among their members. And Brazil has also seen the emergence of a handful of philanthropic foundations with an explicit focus on grant making to human rights CSOs or on community-based forms of funding. Some of the projects I'm talking about, and you can see some of the details about them here, include projects for community-based funding, which devolve decision-making processes on grant spending to different actors within local low-income communities on the outskirts of Sao Paulo, direct grant making to human rights organisations working in areas including reform of the legal and penitentiary systems, very unusual for philanthropists, racial justice and independence of the media, and also work on climate change that's not been afraid to take on government and big business to achieve its aims. In parallel, recent years have also seen the formal consolidation of the Rede de Filantropia para a Justiça Social, the Social Justice Philanthropy Network. This is a group of Brazilian re-granting funds which act as intermediaries between foundation donors and small human rights and environmental CSOs, attempting to stimulate local philanthropic grant making. Also supported by the Rede, the international community philanthropy movement has attracted followers in Brazil, in which CSOs, social movements and other community actors collaborate around the design and self-funding of grassroots social projects. This movement is challenging the definition of philanthropy as a solely elite practice, while also seeing a role for elite philanthropy in contributing to collective democratic funding processes. Now, these are all, make no mistake, small exceptions in the broader landscape of elite philanthropy in Brazil. In interviews I've conducted in Brazil, philanthropists and philanthropy advisors often recount the same list of 5 or 6 names repeatedly. And they've told me that while these people are of great importance in promoting grant making, they are few and far between, and their capacity to influence their peers has so far proved limited. Collaborations between elite philanthropy and human rights organisations also throw up tensions. One philanthropist supporting several human rights CSOs told me that she was actually reluctant to fund organisations that pursued forms of activism that she saw as too radical or combative, especially in the current political climate. Conversely, at a community philanthropy event, one activist raised his hand to express his discomfort with using the term philanthropy at all, due to its strong associations with corporate wealth. So this leads me to ask how we should understand and consider these new forms of possible engagement between elite philanthropy and rights-based social activism in Brazil. Should these examples be seen as hopeful signs of elite collaboration in a growing civil society-led agenda for rights-based reform in Brazil? Or is this aspiration idealistic and naive in a context in which rights-based philanthropy is best understood as a contradiction in terms for an elite project itself propped up by unequal structures of power and capital? And most importantly, perhaps, how should rights-based CSOs respond to advances by elite philanthropists? Do they risk being co-opted into the very structures that their work seeks to challenge? Or is this an opportunity to break through those structures to create change? Over the last year, Bolsonaro's denial of the severity of COVID-19 and adamant refusal to mount a concerted national response have seen the pandemic rip through the Brazilian population with devastating effects, both aided by and exacerbating existing social and economic inequalities. Many working in Brazil's organised civil society sector have noted that this could actually be an ideal moment for elite philanthropy to reconsider its relationship with rights-based CSOs and social movements. The question remains, however, on what and whose terms that relationship might be built. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. I wait to be convinced on the elite philanthropists, but it was good to have something thrown at us in that way. It kind of begs the question about wanting to hear the other side of the argument, which I understand is what you've been mostly arguing about. That is to say, the kind of a philanthropy which isn't really contributing very much in terms of human rights.